So what's up YouTube? If you're watching this video, you're probably trying to figure out what is it truly like to be a software engineer. You probably watch a bunch of day in the life videos, even my day in the life video of a software engineer, but you really want to get a full understanding of what is it truly like being a software engineer. So what's up guys, my name is Kenny, I'm a senior iOS engineer, and in today's video we're going to talk about what is it truly like to be a software engineer. So if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button below, also hit the like button, it definitely helps out the channel. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the video. So being a software engineer, in all honesty, you're gonna be writing a ton of code. But with that being said, you probably want more detail around like how does the code get written, what steps did you guys go through, is there a process in place, and so forth. So what I'm gonna do is pretty much break things down a little bit so it probably makes things a little bit clearer around how things work for a day-to-day process when it comes to being just a general software engineer. So for most software engineers in general, if you're a product engineer, which is what I am, I work on a product because I work for a company called Park Mobile, and we have a product that other customers use. So I'm a product engineer. Also, I'm a iOS engineer, but all overall product engineer. So with that being said, we have a product manager and we also have designers as well as engineers. And we have overhead managers that are overlookers of all the engineers. So the way things typically work is if you're a product engineer and you work on a particular product, the way it go is product will talk to the higher ups or managers to figure out what new features they want to add into the application and so forth. From there, those conversations come down to the engineers as well as the designers. The designers will go through the process of creating designs for whatever the new feature is. And from there, product will spin up tickets for the designers as well as the engineers. After the design is done, then from there we go through the next phase, which those tickets are now handed down to engineers to work on. So when the tickets come down to engineers, depending on the cadence of what your company may use, my company in particular, we run a sprint cadence for the team that I currently work on. So with running with a sprint, the way that'll work is we'll have tickets that'll be in a backlog, which developers will easily go pick up. The tickets will be assigned to developers based on skill as well as what a developer can handle or want to work on. From there, we'll look at the tickets. Each developer will say how much time it'll probably take them to work on whatever ticket that is, and that ticket could be broken down from a larger feature into like smaller parts, if that makes any sense. So say for general, you may be working on building out, I don't know, a map view or some big large feature for your application. I say a great example of that would probably be, say you're building a new login flow for users inside the application. That's a brand new feature you guys want to have inside the app. So you may have to break things down to very small parts so that it's much easier to digest for other developers to work on. So that may mean you may need a login screen, you may need a login button, you may need some text to handle the user typing in their information. You may need a backend ticket so you can handle whenever the user types in the information and the information is taken to a backend to confirm that a user, username and password is accurate, and they're now going to get some kind of information back to the mobile app or to your backend or to your front end. And the front end will go through the process of actually trying to allow the user to log into the application. So if that makes any sense. So with that, you'll have all the information and you'll break those things down into very small tickets so it's easier for a developer to take those tickets and work on and move forward. Once a developer picks up a ticket, a developer will work on that ticket, usually within the allotted time frame that we have set forth. Typically a sprint is always going to be 2 weeks. So you have 2 weeks to work on the tasks that you have. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, typically the code have been reviewed by other developers, as well as it's probably either gone through QA or is in the hands of QA. And when I mean QA, I'm talking about quality assurance, people who will go through the process of actually checking the feature that you built out to make sure everything works accordingly the way that it should work. As far as the developers on their end, once they pick up those tickets, and this kind of backtracking a little bit, once the developer picks up the ticket, they'll go through the process of actually working on the ticket. Once the feature is completed and they've worked on whatever small part that they're wanting to contribute to that feature, what they'll do is they'll push their code up to GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever repository you guys choose to work with. And from there, you'll allow your other developers on your team or engineers, and they'll go through the process of reviewing your code to make sure it's up to standard and everything looks good, so they can go ahead and merge the code in to you guys' develop branch or master branch or whatever feature branch you may have before you want to go through the process of actually shipping out this feature to other people. Once the feature is merged in, you may have like a senior engineer or someone who may handle a release process. Some companies do releases at various cadences. I know some companies do releases every 2 weeks. Some companies do it once a month, once a quarter, once a year. It all depends. But outside of that, that's pretty much it on how things typically work for a day-to-day process with being a software engineer. Now, you do have times where, say you've been working on a ticket and the ticket is taking you much longer than it should be. At that point, that's when things kind of becomes a little bit chaotic. Because in some instances, a product manager may have made a promise to whoever is the higher up over the product itself and saying that, hey, this feature will be done by this date. And, with you being one of the engineers or developers working on that feature, obviously your portion needs to be fixed in order for the entire feature to be 100% complete. So if you're taking longer than needed, then obviously that causes a pushback on the timeline. And if a promise was made, then now this falls back in your court as an engineer, where you may have to work overtime, or you may have to do a couple of things extra, or if it's cool, the time can be pushed back on when it's delivered or so forth. But in my case, I've seen in many cases where a developer may be kind of, in a crossfire because, product has created a timeline in which something's going to be done. You as an engineer made a promise saying like, hey, this ticket was taking me like 4 or 5 days, but it's taking you much, much longer. If it's like a day or two afterwards, it's probably not that big of a deal. But sometimes I've seen it where, a developer said it'll take them 3 days. It might take them like a week or two to get something done. And if that's the case, then it does cause a lot of headache for the product manager, and it may cause a lot of headache for you because now you're going to have someone kind of grilling down your throat saying like, hey, we really need this feature completed. What's going on? And in a lot of cases, if you work on a team with other engineers, well, what typically happen in some cases, not all, in some cases, you may have like a senior engineer who will step in to try to help you get the ticket knocked out or completed, so we can go ahead and move that ticket down the pipeline to go ahead and get completed, and it doesn't back up other developers. Because in many cases, you may be working on a ticket that is impactful for someone else that needs to work on the next part of the ticket that you need to complete. So you may be working on, say, adding the login button and making sure the login button is clickable, and then the next person behind you needs to add some functionality to that login button that you're going to be completing. And if you're taking too long working on the login button, it backs up the timeline for the other person who needs to work on the next feature coming behind it. So it's very, very important to make sure that, whenever you say that it can take you an X amount of time to get something done, it kind of goes through that process. Also, the other thing with being a software engineer that you may run into is you may have bugs that come out of features that you work on. So obviously you'll need to work on those bugs, get those completed, and they'll go through almost the same process. QA would test something, find a bug, they'll kick it back to developers to say like, hey, we found some bugs. We need developers to work on these bugs prior to getting the feature out to the public. They'll go through the process, working on the bug. Once that bug is good and it works like it's supposed to, they'll go back to code review. Developers review the code. Then after reviewing it, it'll go back to QA. QA would test, and then it'll be moved over into like the done column or whatever column you guys may have to say like, okay, everything looks good. We're now at the point where we want to go ahead and do a release. And then you guys will go through the process of doing a release. The only other big thing that you will run into as a software engineer also is the fact that you may have times where you may have major crashes that comes in the application. You may have different things where like data isn't showing on the screen or something drastic like that, which is pretty impactful to the company as a whole and the product. And you being a software engineer, you may have to be on call, or you may have to stay late to try to get something fixed or resolved. Typically, this doesn't happen like all the time, but there are instances where that does happen. Say your team works on a major feature, you launch it to the public, something goes on and it's crashing the app or it's causing another part of the application not to work, and it was something that QA didn't catch. For you as a developer or engineer, you'll have to go through that process of trying to figure out what's wrong, why is it not working, and trying to fix it as soon as possible. It does happen. It's not a thing that happens all the time, but I have worked at companies where it was a repetitive thing that always went on. But there are things that as a software engineer, you and your team can put in place so you don't run into that issue too much. But overall, those are the main things you'll definitely see as a software engineer, or your day-to-day, what it will typically look like. I mean, outside of that, the only other thing that I would say that you would notice, or what is it like being a software engineer, is obviously, you have great benefits, the pay is great. I mean, it's obviously great compared to some other jobs out there in the field, and the pay will vary. Obviously, I think I made a video on it, and I'll probably post it up here. The pay varies depending on, obviously, where you work. If you work for a top tech company, then obviously you'll see those amazing figures of what you'll get paid. If you don't work for the top tech companies, the pay does change a little bit. The further you go down the chain of companies, obviously, if you work for a mom and pop shop or agency, or small agency rather, you're obviously not going to get the same kind of pay if you work for like Google. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Google interviews are 10 times harder compared to some of the other smaller companies. So it makes sense why Google will pay you, those 200, 300K you probably hear about on TikTok and stuff like that. Versus if you work for like a smaller company that doesn't have many employees, or it's not a facing application where everyone's, downloading or using it, and you don't have millions and millions of users, then yeah, you're probably not gonna get that, big, nice 6-figure salary that everybody else is supposedly talking about all over, social media. But yeah, outside of that, the benefits are great. Usually your coworkers will be cool to work with. The dress code is pretty much relaxed. You can wear what you want. I rock sneakers, obviously, so I wear sneakers to work. So yeah, and for some companies nowadays, you get to work remote, so it's pretty cool. So outside that, I just want to thank you guys for watching the video. Again, make sure you subscribe below, and if you like what you see, hit the thumbs up, and I'll see you guys in the next video. See you.